In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
A culture comes into existence whenever a group of people share the same basic living circumstances, and so band together to share beliefs about the rules of survival and emotional prosperity. Now that's true whether it's in the jungles of Samoa or the Salesforce building in San Francisco. It's how do I survive living in this jungle, in this tribe, with this chief? And knowing that I'm going to be okay, then how do I get rewarded emotionally and avoid punishment? And whenever you have a group of people who share the same basic living circumstances, they band together to share these beliefs. Because the more people looking for the same watering hole, the safer it is for everyone. So a culture isn't the shared beliefs about the way things are around here. That's the currency of the culture. A culture is a self-protective organism that obsessively collects data, attempts to validate it, and then shares its findings amongst itself.
This episode is brought to you by Time, Etc., an award-winning virtual assistant company for entrepreneurs. If you are a freelancer or an entrepreneur like me, and you feel like you could do with some extra help from a virtual assistant, Time, Etc. has a very generous offer. It's exclusive for the listeners of Culture Lab, and you can try an assistant for 2 hours completely free of charge. To take advantage of this opportunity, go to www.timeetc.com/culturelab. That's www.timeetc.com/culturelab. Or you can just click on the link in the show notes. I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 36. My guest today is Stan Slap, and he's a thought leader in how to achieve maximum commitment from manager, employee, and customer cultures. He wrote the New York Times best-selling books on business culture, and he's the CEO of the international consulting company called Slap. Stan and his colleagues work with companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Time Warner, and Nike, and his clients swear by his ability to transform their cultures and their results. I have to tell you, Stan talks about culture in a refreshing way. He refers to it as a living, breathing, and conscious organism that collects data, takes decisions, and strives to survive. Now, for the small minority of our listeners who work in the area of culture, this probably makes a lot of sense. And also, if you have psychology or coaching background, you are probably not baffled by any of this either. But if you are none of the above, you must be thinking, okay, this is just a bit too woo-woo for my taste. Well, it might sound woo-woo at the start, but think about it. Jungian scholars have been talking about a collective consciousness for over a century now. And also family therapists and coaches, they have successfully worked with something that they call the third entity. And they've been doing this for decades. And what they found is that the third entity is as real and can be as strong-headed as you and I. Have I lost you yet? Well, stay with me. Let me explain. The third entity is something that lives outside the individuals in a relationship, whether it's a team, a family, or a couple. And to make this simple and relatable, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were individuals. The Beatles was their third entity. And in each team and company, the third entity is their culture. So, without further ado, here is Stan Slap and our conversation about culture. Stan, welcome to Culture Lab.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
I'm really excited to have you as a guest, and I can't wait to ask you all the questions that I've been meaning to ask you. So thank you for making the time for this interview. And for those listeners who are not very familiar with you and your work and your books, would you be able to just give us a very short introduction to who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm the CEO and founder of the international consulting company called, by a remarkable coincidence, SLAP. SLAP is focused exclusively on achieving maximum commitment in the three groups that decide the success of your company: your manager culture, your employee culture, and your customer culture. And we're not talking about a bunch of managers, employees, and customers. When these groups form relationships with your company, they became cultures and became far more resistant to standard methods of corporate influence. So that's our unique expertise. That's what I do. We've been doing it for over 20 years, understanding how these cultures really work and how they decide to work for you. And we do our work in over 90 countries and create legendary metrics impact for many of the world's most successful companies, the kind of companies that don't include patience on their list of corporate values.
I love that. And I'm really curious to hear more about that. But before we go there, I'm really curious about what made Stan Stan. So, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person?
Well, professionally, I think I used to run companies in retail companies that were very dependent upon the will of employees to, in some cases, not just to sell the product and collect the revenue, but to make the product. And there were just various epiphanies over the years that reaching people uh, individually was important, but reaching the belief system that they shared, which I later came to understand as a culture, was what was most important. So I think professionally, what made me who I am is actually having to be responsible for performance from people in companies and realizing that none of the traditional methods seem to be working. Um, other than that, I think culture is where the humans gather in business, and I think what drives me in this work is we've arguably lost humanity in a number of the organizing frameworks in this world. I mean, we've lost humanity in politics. You could argue we've lost it in many cases in religion. If we lose it in business too, we're doomed. If we save it company by company and even manager by manager, then we've saved ourselves. So the work that I do is designed to make the business case for humanity. And where does that come from? I think it comes from living in the world, like all of us, and watching what's happening in the world and thinking, well, I got to make my stand someplace. I got to do something, and this is the place to do it and the way to do it.
So, making a business case for humanity in the workplace, that sounds like quite a challenging task. So, it immediately makes me feel curious. How do you do that?
It's interesting. Companies by now, most companies understand that culture is something that they ought to pay attention to, even if they don't really understand what culture is. And so they pursue it as a path in the business. They devote some attention to it, some resources to it. Well, those same companies definitely understand the performance of the business is important. And that's a path they definitely pursue. And yet, in most companies, these are parallel paths. And the key is to collapse one into the other. You there aren't any combination of resources, time, talent, dollars, whatever, that can drive business performance as reliably as the will of a culture. If a culture wants something to happen in the business, it's going to happen. If it doesn't want it to happen, it's not going to happen. And so when we say make the business case for humanity, we recognize we have to make the business case first. The business and those who run it serve a lot of masters. But when we can reposition these three cultures, manager, employee, and customer cultures, back to the enterprise as precious workable assets, we cause a company to protect them. A company will naturally protect anything that's an asset, especially if it's just been presented as newly squeezable in some way. And you cannot protect these three assets without protecting the humanity they represent, and probably without discovering or rediscovering your own along the way. So it's a chronological equation. We're going to make the business case for you first, but the reason we're doing it is to protect humanity.
Stan, usually now our listeners know that usually I ask this question pretty late in the interview in our rapid fire questions, but my instinct tells me that I should ask you this now. So what is your definition of culture and how did you come up with it?
Well, how we came up with it is when we first started in business over 20 years ago, we were just a bunch of consulting sluts. I mean, we would do anything anybody wanted at any time for any amount of money. People would say, "So is this what you do?" Yes, that's exactly what we do. Really? We have to wear that outfit? We'll wear the outfit. But even in the early unguided missile days of our company, I knew two things for sure. I knew I wanted us to be a great company. And I knew that whatever we sold, I didn't want anybody to be able to buy someplace else. I mean, if you didn't buy it from us, that was a problem we were going to have to solve. But I was already bored with the concept of, oh, yeah, I found it three other places. And so what can you do for me? So great companies, provably, are originated by a deranged radical or group of deranged radicals who have a hardcore point of view about what's right with the world that must be protected and wrong with the world that must be corrected. And they bring that to the business at Genesis because they bring it every place they go. They bring it to the supermarket. And so even in the earliest days when the company's value proposition is first being formed, it's also being created, at least in part, as a delivery vehicle to build a better world. Well, to me, what's wrong with the world that must be corrected is that I think the worst thing that one human being can do to another human being, short of killing someone, is to make them feel small. To say you're not, you can't, you won't. That denial of humanity drives me insane in any form of social or business or governmental abuse when it happens. So the world works. We work, we're affected by other people who work. So in the early days of the company, I started to surface what became a mantra in the company is that nobody should be diminished by business, working in it or buying from it. Because if that happens to you in business, it's not going to stay in business. It's going to jump the fence and follow you home. And those same people are partners and parents and neighbors and voters. The toxic impact of an anxious, uncertain, diminished population is incalculable. Now, in my company, when I started to say that stuff all the time, people said, "Well, we love that. Who wouldn't love that?" Well, we found out. One of our clients was a very large IT company who shall remain nameless, but is kind of renowned for unapologetically not caring anything about humanity. And we were working with the CEO and his C-suite. And so we decided on the big coming out day of this mantra. And I was in a meeting, it might have even been in a meeting I called with them. But we were in a meeting and with the C-suite of this major, multi-billion dollar company. And I said, listen, before we begin here, I think there's one thing we can all agree on. Nobody should be diminished by business, working in it or buying from it. And the room just stopped. And I thought, yes. And then I looked at the person sitting across from me, and all they were trying to do is figure out what the hell I was talking about. It was like, yeah, okay. Anyway, about these numbers. And I remember leaving that meeting saying, oh my God, this has no value whatsoever to a large profitable enterprise. How am I going to make this urgently of value? That led me to culture. Because again, culture is where the humans gather in business. The problem was, this was 20 years ago. Even today, culture remains the most overused, least understood concept in business. Back then, nobody was even really talking about it. So I had to try and figure out what is a culture. And what I was hearing, which you still hear today, when you ask people what's a culture, it's the commonly shared beliefs about the way things are around here. Well, that made no sense to me at all. I mean, that had to be just like part of the story. Like, shared beliefs about what? Who decided we had to share these beliefs? Who said, listen, we need a big filing cabinet here that everybody has access to? It just didn't make any sense. Uh, I didn't finish high school, but I know how to read. So I started reading about anthropology, all the classic Margaret Mead, Claude Levi Strauss. I read everything I could get my hands on. It still didn't make any sense to me, but I began to piece together my own definition and then test the hypotheses to myself. And eventually I created a definition that I could sort of get some confirmation in various anthropology texts, and that a culture comes into existence whenever a group of people share the same basic living circumstances, and so band together to share beliefs about the rules of survival and emotional prosperity. Now that's true whether it's in the jungles of Samoa or the Salesforce building in San Francisco. It's how do I survive living in this jungle, in this tribe with this chief? And knowing that I'm going to be okay, then how do I get rewarded emotionally and avoid punishment? And whenever you have a group of people who share the same basic living circumstances, they band together to share these beliefs. Because the more people looking for the same watering hole, the safer it is for everyone. So a culture isn't the shared beliefs about the way things are around here. That's the currency of the culture. A culture is a self-protective organism that obsessively collects data, attempts to validate it, and then shares its findings amongst itself. And so when I had that definition. We have a saying in my company: "Born of ignorance, backed by science." So I make everything up because it makes sense to me, and then I have to subject myself to the most ruthless discovery before we actually do something with it. So anyway, this was a long time ago, and I said, well, I've got to take this to the most renowned authority that I can find, which was the Oxford Department of Anthropology. And so I typed this thing up and gave it to them. And I said, listen, please don't hurt me. Okay. Listen, I know, what are the chances that some idiot sitting in a room in San Francisco could have found a new definition of culture? So I know it's wrong. I just want to know how wrong it is. I mean, are there a couple of words in there that on their own are actually accurate? Tell me, because I can't find what's wrong with it. And they spent some time with it and came back and said, we've never considered culture as the actor, as the organism, but this is entirely valid anthropologically. So I had that validation, and then we just had to turn it into a business model and make it work. And that's what we did.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I really love about your work is exactly the fact that you speak about culture as a living, breathing organism and being that evolves and reacts and, as you say, gathers information. I also heard you say that culture is measurable, genetic, and hereditary. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yes, it's definitely measurable. I'm asked all the time uh, for the definition of a great culture. And I think people expect me to say it's a happy culture. Well, yeah, you don't want your culture to be actively unhappy. That's not a good thing. But a great culture is a committed culture. And the commitment of a culture is measurable with any metric you use to manage the business. So a culture is not some ethereal, fluffy thing that's subordinate to the performance of the business itself. If the business is performing well with any metric you use to measure it, then that's because the culture is committed to causing that to happen. And by genetic, I mean that every member of the employee every employee rather in a company is automatically a member of the employee culture. The culture knows that the more people searching for that safe watering hole, the safer it is for everyone. So you can do whatever you want in your glorious onboarding process and that stuff disappears the minute a new employee is paid a visit their first hour by the cultural welcome wagon, who's going to tell them the way things really are around here. And so every member of the every employee is a member of the employee culture. There's no rope line, there's no probationary period. Every manager is a member of the manager culture because the rules of survival and emotional prosperity for managers are distinct enough from the general employee population to make it an independent culture. And so it's genetic. And in terms of being hereditary, a culture exists to protect itself. So at some point, every culture in every company had to put a stake in the ground to say, this is the way things are around here. When the culture puts a stake in the ground, it makes some key decisions. Like, should it trust management when management talks? Should it commit financially and intellectually and physically, but withhold its emotional commitment? When it gets recognized for its performance, does that mean it's safer? A lot of other key decisions are made. Now, culture doesn't try and get it wrong when it puts that stake in the ground, but it could have. I mean, it only had the data it had and its ability to interpret it. Doesn't matter. Stake goes in the ground, the major belief system of the culture is formed. And because a culture is a human organism, once it makes a decision, like all of us human organisms, it doesn't look for data to contradict the decision. It looks for data to confirm it. So even if the culture innocently got it wrong, it has since found a lot of what it considers valid proof points to hardwire that belief system.
Confirmation bias, yeah.
Yes, and so to your point, the issue here is you don't know when your culture put that stake in the ground. It could have been last week. It could have been last year. It could have been 10 years ago. And in most cases, it is a belief system passed down from one tenure generation to the next. And time does not dilute a culture's thinking. That's managers' fantasies. Time confirms a culture's decision. And so there's a toy. Let me just wrap it up with this. There's a toy in America called an Etch-a-Sketch. It's a little square like TV screen. It's been around for 50 years with a couple of knobs.
We had it where I grew up as well. I grew up in Poland. I had one of those.
So you know what it is. And then when you finish your little drawing, you shake it and it's a new screen again. That's the way companies like to believe that a culture's belief system works. Oh, it's a new strategy. Forget all those heinous acts we committed last. Now we're just going to shake it and start all over again. Yeah, and it doesn't work like that. Whatever you want the culture to do now means you are dealing with its legacy belief system. And unless you have a way of understanding what that contains so you can recalibrate it, you're just going to bounce off the atmosphere of what it already believes is real.
Mm-hmm. So do I understand correctly, Stan, that if you hope to change your culture or implement a new strategy, you first have to understand your current employee culture? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, you do. And you have to recognize that because your employee culture exists to protect itself, it's a closed society to the company. It is not going to naturally reveal its true motivations and perceptions. That would make it vulnerable. So anything like some silly engagement survey is just not going to work at all. You've got to get the culture to talk to you like it really talks to itself in order to really find out how to move it. I mean, the good news is a culture's belief system is not static. It has to remain open to input so it can keep current about the rules of survival and emotional prosperity. So you can change it, but you have to change it in a way that's credible to the culture.
Right. Wait, because it completely blew my mind now. So
sorry
I
about that.
I have to rewind now. This is fascinating. So you say you have to speak to your culture in the same way it speaks to itself. So how does it speak to itself, and how do you have to speak to your culture to understand it?
A culture deals in the real. It really can't afford flights of fancy. It's its purpose is to protect itself. So it may be temporarily inspired by some message from the company or from management, but its own concerns are different. This is the frustrating thing for companies who say, understandably, for senior management who says, wait a minute, if the culture is concerned about its survival, okay, we'll handle this. Do your job and you'll keep it. And what, there's some emotional thing? Okay, do a good job and we'll tell you you're doing a good job. But that stuff would only work if your culture perceives a reliable through line between what happens to the company and what happens to the culture. And chances are that's not true. I mean, if you think of the best days for the company, that the company acquires another company, or the company launches some major new strategy, or reacts to market pressure by dramatically cutting costs and remains a vibrant company, all of those things mess with the known rules of survival and emotional prosperity for the culture. So many of the company's best days are the worst days for the culture. If you want to sell to the culture, you have to recognize that a culture is an independent organism living right inside the company with its own purpose and all the power to make or break any management plan and any manager. Its purpose is to protect itself, not the company. And so if you want its maximum commitment, it's a matter of aligning its sense of how it protects itself with, coincidentally, how you need it to protect the company. And you can't just continue to make the company case over and over and over again. You have to make the case for the culture, the way the culture is going to consider it valuable.
So how do you make this case for culture in a way that culture considers it valuable? Because I think for our listeners, they're thinking, okay, I sort of get it. Yes, I follow that thinking, but how do I do that? How do I engage with culture in a way that it actually starts feeling like, oh, okay, I can engage with that. I can follow that. I'm willing to listen.
Okay, well, it's the perfect question, and it's a huge one. But just tactically, some things you can do right now, not in any particular order, is recognizing that management is focused on success. So it's always looking forward to see what can be sold next. Our culture is focused on survival. It's always looking backwards to see what happened to the last thing it was sold. Did it work out as promised? So if you need your culture to trust you, recognize that it's not gonna really trust you the way you want it to. So don't ask for that trust. The way you earn trust with a culture is a little bit at a time. Say to your culture, listen, here's the new plan. We're here and we're going here. When we get there, everything is going to be fabulous. Really, there'll be cartoon birds in the trees. It'll be raining cupcakes. That's going to happen. Everything will be great. Should you trust me when we tell you this? No, you'd be crazy to trust me. We're not asking you to trust us this far. We're only asking you to trust us this far. In the next 90 days, here's 2 small things that will definitely happen in the name of what we're telling you. And in the next 90 days, here's 2 small things that will never happen in the name of what we're telling you. And we're going to deliver on those small things. And when we do, we're going to come back and negotiate for more trust. So you put the culture in a position where it does not have to risk its survival in order to see if you can be trusted.
Mm-hmm. So you make it safe for culture.
You make it safe for culture, yes.
Yeah.
I would say one other thing, I just trying to be tactical. This is what we do for a living. We could talk forever, but let me give you one example. We had a company come to us who really was trying to do the right thing for its culture, and they recognized that if they did that, the culture would deliver the performance that the company needed. And so they went through their policy manuals, and this was an international hotel chain. They went through their policy manuals with an eye toward taking every policy and improving it for the culture. It was really a legitimate effort. And they did. They changed everything. They changed maternity leave, paternity leave, let employees show their tattoos that they were proud of them. They went through the facilities, and usually the front of a hotel that you see as a guest is fabulous, and the back of the seventh circle of hell. They actually painted it and fumigated it and put chairs in it. They did everything. And they got a little bump in performance when they did that. And then it went back to the way it was before, which is why they called us in. And we said, well, here's what you did. This is a mistake that companies make all the time, is you did, let's say, 20 great things for the culture. And the culture looked at those things and said, oh, we like those things. Now, because we deal in the real, we understand that you want something for that. So we're going to take this back to our cultural exchange mart and put it on the scale and tell you what you got for that. Now, you want something else? Do something else for us. And what happened is the company, like many companies that try and do things for their culture, had inadvertently created a transactional culture.
That's exactly my reaction when I hear you describe it. It sounds very, very transactional. So is there a way to avoid that?
There is a simple but essential way to avoid it, because what the company really wanted was a protective culture. So if the company had done those same 20 things for the culture, but set context ahead of time by emphatically, dramatically declaring its intention about the way the culture would be allowed to live in this company, then those 20 things would have served as proof points to the culture that there is a connectivity between what management says and what management does. At that point, the material aspect of those 20 things doesn't even matter. What matters is, oh my God, this could be a dependable place. This could be safe, because there's now a connection between what management declared was most important and the actions it takes. Well, if it could be a safe company, that's something we want to protect.
Okay, so that's clarified this a little bit for me. So I understand then how you can engage with culture. So you really have to be very clear, very intentional, and then you really have to deliver the goods consistently and step by step.
Yeah, so a culture, and by the way, a culture, here's the problem that almost every company causes for themselves. When companies talk to cultures, they talk about the what, the how, and the why. And when a culture doesn't appear to be particularly moved by that, the company talks louder, because clearly the problem is just that the culture didn't hear management when management was talking. And when the culture still doesn't move, it's assumed that the culture has all the intellectual agility of a small soap dish and does not understand the elegance and urgency of these corporate strategies. But when you're talking to a culture, the what, the how, and the why does not matter. The only thing that matters is the why not. Why, given the corporate logic and urgency of what you're asking a culture to do, would it not do it? And that's the only space that we play in, is the why not. If you just continue to make the business case over and over and over again without making the culture's case, then you're going to just leave the culture in the why not, and you're never going to penetrate that thinking.
And the reason that you want to speak to the why not is, again, because you want to make it safe for culture, right?
That's right. The culture is an information gathering organism designed to assure its own survival.
Yeah.
And so your culture is not anti-business. It's not anti-strategy. It's not anti-performance. It's not anti-management. It is anti-unsafe.
This episode is brought to you by Time Etc., an award-winning virtual assistant company for entrepreneurs. I started using Time Etc. just a couple of months after I established my own consulting business. I reached out to them because, like many entrepreneurs out there, I felt completely overwhelmed with work. I was putting in incredibly long hours. I wasn't sleeping enough. I was working on the weekends, and yet it seemed completely impossible to get it all done. It got to a point where I knew that something was going to give, so begrudgingly at first, I decided to get some help. Initially, I worked with just one Time Etc. assistant, but I quickly realized that it made a huge difference. So many things were taken care of, from scheduling appointments to arranging travel, updating my website, and formatting documents. I saved hours of time that I could spend serving my clients, recharging my batteries, enjoying hanging out with my loved ones. And as my business started to grow, so did my Time Etc. team. And now I have 3 assistants, and really, I can't imagine my life without them. Lindsay, Rachel, and Emily are absolutely brilliant. But what I love most about Time Etc. is the fact that they create an opportunity for people to be location independent and to work from home. This has always been important for me, as my husband and I live what some would call a modern nomad life. And I really want to support a company that creates this opportunity to be location independent for others. If you are a freelancer or an entrepreneur like me, and you feel like you could do with some extra help from a virtual assistant, Time Etc. has a very generous offer exclusively for the listeners of Culture Lab. You can try an assistant for 2 hours, free of charge. And to take advantage of this opportunity, you just need to go to www.timeetc.com/culturelab. That's www.timeetc.com/culturelab. You can also just click on the link in the show notes. So my conclusion from this conversation here is that probably number one priority when you really want to engage with your culture is to make it safe for it first, and then continuously keep in mind that everything that culture sees, it's going to filter through that lens of, is it safe for us? So I have another question for you, sort of on behalf really of our listeners, because I get this question really often, particularly from middle managers who know that the culture in the organization really has to change. And I think what they mean very often is our senior management culture has to change. And also our employee culture has to change, because very often for middle managers, they feel slightly disassociated from both of these groups, and they don't identify with any of them. And so very often they ask me, how do I convince my senior leaders that we need to change our culture? And another question that they ask is, how do I convince our employees that we need to start behaving in a slightly different way? I know that you have addressed this to a certain extent, but particularly to this question, how do I convince our senior leaders that we need to change our culture? What do you have to say to that?
Well, one of the ways that we do it when we have to convince culture is what we call the Goldfinger argument. Do you remember the old James Bond film Goldfinger? Yeah. Okay. Well, there's an iconic scene in that movie where James Bond is strapped to a table, and there's a laser beam that's cutting the table in two, and he's frantically trying to negotiate his way out of this problem, and nothing appears to be working, and the laser beam is just about ready to reorg critical portions of his anatomy, and he finally says to Goldfinger, listen, if you kill me, they'll just send another agent to take my place. And Goldfinger gives him that villain look and says, I don't think so, Mr. Bond. And Bond says, can you afford to take that chance? And the laser beam shuts off. So when we're dealing with the C-suite, CEOs, even boards, what we say is, listen, if the last 10 strategies, performance strategies, go-to-market strategies, internal transformation strategies, whatever they are, if the last 10 strategies in this company worked exactly like they were supposed to, they happened when they were supposed to happen, they cost what they were supposed to cost, they did what they were supposed to do, then you probably don't need to know anything more about how to harness the maximum commitment of your culture. But if you're betting your company and your career on the next 10 in a hyper-competitive market, can you afford to take the chance that they'll work as poorly as the last ones did? We've never been asked to leave. So again, this is the issue of recognizing that culture is not some ethereal, fluffy thing. It is the primary driver of business performance. There are a lot of metrics. Here's another argument to deal with for the senior leader. There's a lot of metrics, many metrics that evidence the commitment of a culture, like we talked about. But the biggest metric of all of cultural commitment will not be shown unless the culture needs to show it. which is that if the company really gets into trouble, only a committed culture will step up to save it. Now, you can't bank that when you need it. You have to put it away ahead of time. So creating cultural commitment and actually doing something about your culture is not just a matter of achieving performance. It's a matter of achieving performance insurance. And that is the ultimate legacy impact and maximum responsibility of any senior executive in any company.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk to senior leaders about those things, I'm curious about two things. One is, how do they react to your way of defining culture? Because you have a very unique way of speaking about culture, it being a living, breathing organism. So that's my first question. How do they react to that? Can they resonate with that? Do you care to answer this one first, and then I'll continue with my second one?
So we work in 90 countries.
Mm-hmm.
And with all due respect to the social and geopolitical individualities of all those countries, when you're talking about the relationship between employees, managers, and customers and their company, a culture is, to most intents and purposes, a culture. And so when we make that definition clear, what we get is a sudden epiphany. You see executives, they're usually bringing us in because they're looking forward. How do we get this to happen? But you see immediately, it's almost like you can viscerally tell they're also looking backwards to say, oh my God, that's why nothing has ever worked here the way it's supposed to. Yeah.
So that's the first question that I had. And then the second question is, do they see that necessity of creating that culture capital for the future as well? Because as you say, you have to make the investment today for the company perhaps to make the withdrawal 10 years from now. And from my experience, I'm not saying that all companies operate like that, but a lot of companies focus just on the next quarter. So trying to appeal to this longer term view sometimes can be quite difficult with some companies.
Well, when we're saying performance insurance, ultimately, yes. If you get this in place and you leave the company and 10 years later, the company gets rocked by unfortunate circumstances and is able to survive because of what you put in place, that is real bragging rights. But you don't have to wait 10 years. That stuff is happening like every month. So the commitment of a culture is either the company has just had a very recent memory of, we got into trouble and our culture did not step up to save us, did not evangelize our intentions to the world outside the company. It's either a recent memory or it's a current concern. So it's not that long term of an argument. And then the higher up you get in an organization, the hierarchy, the more when you get to the CEO level, any reasonably sophisticated CEO is thinking about their legacy impact, understands that their real bragging rights are going to happen after they leave the company. I'd say it's not that big of a leap for them to understand.
So I have a question from one of our listeners. Time for your questions.
Hi, Aga. This is Alison McTavish from Switzerland.
Hi, this is Dale Hintz. I'm submitting a question to the Culture Lab.
Hi, Aga. I just want to say thank you so much for doing the podcast.
I have a question for Culture Lab.
Hello, my name is Morten Abbey from Denmark.
Hi, Ed. This is Tim Coupler.
Hi, I'm Kostas. I have a question for you, Michael.
I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for entertaining my question.
This is Zaid Alal calling from Saudi Arabia. What's missing in culture consulting business to be as important to organizations as management consulting? Thank you.
Oh, Rad, that's a superb question. And my experience with that is that most consulting companies, and I'm saying most, I'm not trying to specifically diss anybody else's work or success or anything else. It's just that the experience that we have, especially with very large companies, is they've brought in cultural consulting companies before and found that nothing happened. And so most consulting practices have a culture specialty now. That's a suddenly bolted on practice that they didn't even have a few years ago. It's like 20 years ago, every ad agency had to claim that they were also a brand agency. And so in many cases, the company, the consulting practice really isn't informed by an accurate idea of what a culture is. They just have a bunch of big ideas that they're trying to get the client to fund to see if anything will actually work. And the biggest mistake is this continuing failure to recognize that the commitment of a culture is not an independent business issue, independent from business performance. It is the driver of business performance. So when you're talking about a culture, you are talking about everything the business needs to get done that is measurable. So I would say, in answer to your excellent question, Rad, it's first of all, do these companies really even understand what a culture is? Have they actually done this work and proven that it works? And also, are they able to make the case? Are they taking a cultural problem that their client is giving them and not course correcting their client's thinking to say, no, what you're really talking about is this. What you really want is this. Or are they just saying, okay, it's a cultural problem. We'll just work on it as a cultural problem. It's a business problem.
We have this section in the podcast, which is called Rapid Fire Q&A. And I'm basically going to ask you 4 questions in rapid succession, and we'll aim to answer them in under 2 minutes.
Wow.
Are you
Okay.
up for that?
Yeah.
All right,
yeah. Bring it on.
All right, let's do it.
All right.
So what are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Well, again, like we've been talking about, the signs are any failure of performance in the business. Any metric that the business sets for itself or that is set for the business that is not happening according to the business is an indicator of low cultural commitment. And so that's a sign. If you're not getting done what you need to get done, that's a sign. If you need to call the culture to order and find that it's drifting on you, that's a sign. If you're not able to recruit and retain top talent in a competitive market, that's a sign. And if you're betting the success of your company on some declared intention, and you find that your culture is not willing to advocate that intention and evangelize it to your customer culture, that's a sign. All of those things are indicators. If you have to spend more and more money trying to bribe a culture to do its job, that's a sign. Culture doesn't care about money. It cares about the meaning of the money.
I love that word, bribe the culture to do what you wanted to do. Love it. What company do you admire for their culture and why?
Oh, I think if we're looking at iconic companies that everybody would recognize, Costco, I know those guys very well, including at the top. A spectacular job of really understanding culture and believing that if we protect the culture will protect the business. For all their sometimes awkward ways of lurching out with passionate declarations into the marketplace, I think Starbucks is focused on really trying to do the right thing for its culture. I think the turnaround with Satya at Microsoft is a tremendous example for anyone to see how you actually cause massive cultural change from the top in a complex global enterprise.
Mm. And what books on culture or leadership would you recommend? Aside your books, of course. And to your books, clearly.
I truly believe that they are, because they're the largest publisher in the world, that Penguin Random House was my publisher. If I started to recommend another book, they have this chair wired and I would get electrocuted. I do. Listen, I'm sure there are a lot of great books out there. I don't know. I write my own stuff. We're obsessed with our own work. So I really want to give you a better answer to this question. I'm not sure. I would say Yeah, I'm just not sure.
No worries.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So, one last question in this series. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Oh, I think that one thing, like one piece of advice you're asking me? Okay.
Yeah, something actionable, something that you can actually start doing tomorrow, a simple thing that will have an impact.
I would say two things. One, recognize that a culture, like any organism, only has a limited amount of energy to give you. And if it perceives that it's down to its last remaining stores of energy, it's going to use those to protect itself, not to protect the company. Before you step on the gas, make sure that the tanks are filled. There are three sources of a culture's energy. One is context. Make sure your culture can understand why something is happening. The second is predictability. Make sure your culture can understand what's going to happen next. And if it can't tell what's going to happen next, no matter what's going to happen, what the company would do about it in any number of situations. And the third is a sense of self. Can your culture take a positive sense of self from affiliating with not just the scale of the company or its ferocious financial success, but the true character? What does it say about me to be part of this company? So I would say continue to top off those energy tanks so that your culture has got enough energy to give you without thinking it's risking the energy it needs to protect itself. And you do that by constantly providing context, constantly providing predictability, constantly providing a sense of self. And the other thing, my most important recommendation to anyone managing a company or even managing the concept of a culture is to be human first, a manager second.
I love that. Love that piece of advice. So important, and we forget about that. So I want to circle back to three types of cultures. We talked a little bit about employee culture and management culture, but we haven't really talked a lot about customer culture. So how did you come up with that, and what does it really mean, and why is it important for companies to take customer culture into consideration as well?
Well, when we first started our business, I had this proprietary, unique definition of culture that had been vetted by experts, but I still didn't have a business model. Our original business model was, I thought, well, certainly there are three cultures in a company because the rules of survival and emotional prosperity that are shared by a group are distinct for managers, they're distinct for employees, and they're distinct for customers. A culture is not a bunch of managers, employees, and customers. It's the belief system that's formed when those groups create a relationship with a company. So the thing that customers have in common is that they all have a relationship with the company. And so clearly there were three cultures, and what I was looking for as a business model is, what if there was one problem within each of those cultures that had the biggest impact on any company, and that even the biggest companies had not been able to solve? What a great business model if we could solve it. So I'll skip the suspense. We solved it. And in a manager culture, the biggest issue is emotional detachment from managers. When you get intellectual commitment, financial commitment, and physical commitment, but you miss emotional commitment, which is worth more than all those combined. So we know how to solve that. We do that. In an employee culture, the biggest issue is companies are betting, if not their lives and their success, on being able to roll out new strategies constantly. But a successful strategy isn't planned well, it's implemented well, and you can't sell it outside if you can't sell it inside. So how do you create ferocious support for any company goal, plan, intention? So we know how to do that. When it comes to a customer culture, the biggest issue to a company is we're not part of our customer culture. We're standing outside the culture trying to sell it something. How do we transfer sustainability of our company to our customers? How do we get our customers to advertise and sell for us and protect us if we stumble or get attacked? Well, a company that can do that is called a brand. That is the true definition of a brand. Branded is not a verb. You can't brand something. You can't call yourself a brand. It's a tribute. It has to be given to you. And a brand promise is a company saying to the world, you will know us by our intention. Now, that intention has got to be represented by your employee culture with its own good name to other people. And your customer culture has to ignore its well-earned cynicism about those kind of fruity company promises and a lot of other seductive logical buying options. So in order for you to become a brand and transfer sustainability of your company to your customers, you have to cause both of these cultures to answer a question that is unanswerable so that they can give you the one thing they don't want to give you. And the question that they have to answer for themselves is, how can we trust you when you tell us you care? And there's no real way to know this if you're going to really deliver on this intention. So to become a brand, it's not about achieving trust in these cultures, which they don't want to give you anyway, because trust makes you vulnerable. You have to create the deepest level of trust possible. You have to create faith. And faith is, I believe, but I don't know. Now, a culture doesn't even like to trust. To give you unfounded trust is its rarest gift. And the reason we got into this work, about half of our work as a company is on the brand side, is because if there's one thing we know as a company, it's how to create that deepest level of trust from a culture.
So do you have any closing remarks, Stan? Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would. Thanks. I would like to leave them with a message for them as management, assuming that they're either running companies and at some level, or they're helping other companies run themselves. And then I'd like to leave them with a message for them as managers. As management, I would say that that your culture will give you whatever you want. You just have to give it what it wants first. And respecting what it really wants is a difference between its defiance and its compliance. So the biggest epiphany about culture for management is that it is not the responsibility of your culture to understand the business logic. It is a responsibility of your business to understand the culture's logic. That if you get that one thing right, you are unbeatable in any market you choose to own. And then finally, for anyone listening to this podcast as a manager, either with the title and responsibility of a manager or managing this issue, I don't know where you may be in your management career, in the arc of your management career, but I don't think wherever you are, at the beginning, in the middle, nearing the end, it's ever too early to start looking at it like it had already concluded. Like your career as a manager had finally ended. What do you want it to have stood for? Do you want it to have made money, built companies? These are very good things. Do you want to have had a legacy impact on the lives of the human beings who helped you do that? Now, that's a great thing. And you don't have to give up the very good things to get the great thing, but you have to want the great thing. The understanding the true motivations of an employee culture and how to maximize its commitment can be the difference between your career success and failure, or your company's success and extreme success. But this is not just about your career or your company. As a manager, you have a tremendous lingering influence on the lives of the members of your employee culture. If they are made to feel small, anxious, and diminished at work, again, that's not going to stay on the job. That's going to jump the fence and follow them home. So treating your culture with empathy and grace is not simply a job performance tactic. It is a mirror that reflects your own true humanity.
Stan Slap, I can't think of a better way to end this interview. Thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you are doing. I think it's really, really amazing. And it definitely influenced to a great extent the way I think about culture. So thank you. Thank you for researching and reading all these books and trying to figure things out, you know? and then sharing your theory with anthropologists in Oxford and just publishing your books. Really, it's a tremendous gift to all of us.
You're too kind. I'm honored, and I wish you all the best in your own company. You're doing great work, and for any listener who takes this up and starts doing it as well, you're doing the big work.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stan.
All right. Take care.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Content Editor, Rachel Nice.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
So, if you haven't subscribed to Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. And if you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, just go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review Culture Lab on iTunes or anywhere else you listen to it. Don't miss the opportunity to get the 2 hours of virtual assistance time as part of Time Etc's exclusive offer for our listeners. You can find the link in the show notes. And before I say goodbye, I want to give you a preview of my next interview with Bruce Daisley. Bruce Daisley is the Vice President of Twitter for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and he joined the company in 2012, having previously run YouTube UK at Google. Bruce is the creator and host of the #1 business podcast in the UK. It's one of the podcasts that I regularly listen to. It's called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. And he also recently published a book, which is called The Joy of Work. Those of you who are subscribers of my newsletter already know it, have been introduced to it. I would definitely recommend reading it. And here is a preview of our conversation.
Culture always comes from the insurgent. It always comes from the outside. Culture is never defined by the mainstream, is it? In music, in art, in technology, it's never. It wasn't Microsoft that created the iPhone. Culture's never evolves from the sort of the consensus of what's going on. Culture always comes from the insurgent. So my view is arm the insurgent with evidence, and arm them with the power of sort of science, and I'm certain they can change the culture. And I tell you what, if they try their best and they can't change the culture in their organisation, then it's just proof to them they're in the wrong organisation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.